Hello and welcome to Sleepsmyth, your peaceful place to unwind, dream and drift gently into sleep. Before we start our story tonight, let me help you settle in with a simple, calming breath like a gentle lullaby for your body and mind. So, find a cozy spot, maybe snuggle under your blanket, and softly close your eyes. Now, breathing quietly through your nose for 4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold that breath softly for 7 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And now, slowly exhale through your mouth for 8 seconds, letting all the tension melt away. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Let's do that again. Nice and easy. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. One last time, just like a soft whisper. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Feel your body getting lighter, your mind quiet, as if you're being tucked gently into a calm, warm bed. Thank you for sharing this moment with Sleepsmyth. Now, relax completely and let the story carry you into a peaceful, restful sleep. Let's begin.
In courts of gold and marble, beneath chandeliers that shimmer like captured starlight, crowns have always demanded more than loyalty. They have demanded everything. Hearts were pledged, alliances forged, and vows whispered in chambers where ambition moved like a living shadow. And yet, for some, devotion to the crown became a perilous path, a journey where love, duty, and even life itself could be claimed by the very throne they served. Tonight, we trace the lives of 3 women whose stories are carved in the cold brilliance of monarchy, where loyalty could be repaid with scorn, and where crowns, though radiant, were often laced with betrayal. These are queens who gave all, yet were discarded, humiliated, or destroyed in a world that measured value not in virtue, but in the fragile calculus of power and intrigue. First, we meet Marie Antoinette, the Austrian Archduchess who became Queen of France. Adored, envied, and vilified, she danced through the gilded halls of Versailles while whispers of scandal and rumor grew louder with each step. From courtly splendor to the unforgiving edge of revolution, she became a symbol of a monarchy's collapse, the innocence of a young queen entangled in a nation's wrath. Next, we follow Anne Boleyn, whose cleverness, charm, and ambition reshaped the English crown itself. From lady-in-waiting to the center of political storms, her rise was meteoric, her influence profound, yet the price of favor was cruelly exacted. Accusations, intrigue, and a king's desire would turn triumph into tragedy, leaving Anne as both architect and casualty of a court where betrayal was the currency of power. Finally, we turn to Mary Stuart, a monarch whose trust became both shield and snare. Born to rule but betrayed by those she counted on, she navigated a Scotland torn by religious conflict, political rivalry, and shifting loyalties. Exiled and imprisoned, her claim to the throne endured in letters, plots, and conspiracies, until her final hour at Fotheringhay revealed the ultimate toll of a life defined by ambition, love, and relentless betrayal. These are stories of crowns that demanded blood, of loyalty tested and shattered, of women who became both sovereign and sacrifice. Tonight, we step into the corridors where power is absolute, but trust is scarce, where every gesture, glance, and promise carries weight, and where the throne, radiant as it may appear, can consume those who serve it most faithfully. Prepare to walk through gilded halls, across turbulent kingdoms, and into the hearts of women whose devotion to monarchy was absolute, whose courage was undeniable, and whose fates were written not in gold, but in fire and blood. Queen Marie Antoinette of France, the queen who danced toward the guillotine. Vienna's golden bargain. In the heart of Vienna, where music drifts through marble halls and chandeliers glow like captive suns, a young archduchess is being prepared for destiny. Her name is Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa, born not merely to live, but to serve a crown beyond her own. From the moment she could walk, lessons surrounded her like the air she breathed. Priests taught her devotion, musicians shaped her grace, tutors corrected her posture until she seemed almost carved from duty itself. Her mother ruled with a hand both tender and iron, loving her children fiercely but shaping each as a piece in the vast game of empires. Austria looked to France, its old rival turned uneasy ally. Peace between them was fragile, a thread spun by diplomats and sealed by marriage. And so, when the Dauphin of France required a bride, Maria Theresa's eyes turned to her youngest daughter. Not the most brilliant, not the most learned, but charming, beautiful, and pure of heart, perfect for a kingdom that measured power by appearance as much as strength. In the spring of 1770, Vienna filled with celebrations for the match. Courtiers whispered blessings, musicians played waltzes that spoke of triumph, and tailors stitched gowns of silver and white. But beneath the celebration, there lingered the quiet understanding that this was a bargain more than a betrothal. Austria would gain security, France an heir, and the girl herself, a stranger's life in a stranger's land. On the morning she left, clouds gathered over the Danube. The carriages gleamed, the horses stamped, the banners fluttered gold against grey sky. At the border between Austria and France stood a wooden pavilion, draped in velvet and silence. There, as custom demanded, she was stripped of all things Austrian, her clothes, her jewels, even her attendants. To enter France, she must be reborn as someone else. When she emerged, she wore the blue and silver of her new home. Her name now reshaped upon foreign lips, Marie Antoinette. Behind her lay the warmth of Vienna, the laughter of siblings, the scent of waltzes carried through palace corridors. Before her, an unknown kingdom awaited, glittering, watchful, and cold. The journey to Versailles stretched long through forests and villages. where peasants waved and cried blessings to the new Dauphine. She smiled and waved, still too young to sense the weight behind their cheers. Each mile carried her farther from childhood and deeper into history. At 14, she was no longer her mother's daughter. She was now France's promise. A golden thread binding two empires. A living bargain, radiant and trembling, drawn toward a destiny too vast to see. And somewhere in the quiet of that endless road, beneath the rhythm of carriage wheels, the girl from Vienna whispered her first prayer as a queen in waiting, unaware that the crown awaiting her would one day demand everything she had to give. Silk and suspicion. The carriage rolled through the golden gates of Versailles, and the world that met Marie Antoinette's eyes seemed spun from another realm. The palace shimmered in the sunlight, its windows glinting like hundreds of small suns. Gardens unfolded in perfect geometry, fountains rose in silver streams, and statues watched in silence as she passed. It was a place built not for comfort, but for awe. Every step within it was a performance, every glance a gesture rehearsed across generations. And now, this young girl from Vienna was its newest star, the Dauphine of France. Inside, she was met with ceremony so intricate it felt almost unreal. Maids of honor, ladies in waiting, chamberlains, all moved in patterns of ritual that governed even the simplest act. She could not dress alone, eat alone, or walk unobserved. To live at Versailles was to exist upon a stage where every movement might be judged by 100 unseen eyes. Her tutors began again, this time not of music or virtue, but of language and posture. Her French, though soft and pleasant, was corrected until it bore no trace of Vienna. Her handwriting was rewritten, her manners refined to match the exact rhythm of court grace. And though she smiled through it all, she sometimes found herself longing for the laughter of home, the warm disorder that Versailles could never permit. Her husband, the Dauphin Louis Auguste, was gentle but shy, a boy more comfortable with keys and locks than with words of affection. Their marriage, celebrated across Europe, remained cold. Years passed before they would share what all of France awaited, a child, an heir, a sign that their union was blessed. In the absence of that joy, the court began to murmur. They whispered in corridors and salons, about her laughter, her clothes, her spending, even her friendships. Each smile was examined, each kindness misunderstood. She was too light-hearted, they said, too fond of pleasure, too Austrian. Even her husband's kindness could not shield her from the slow frost of suspicion that began to spread through the gilded halls. She wrote letters home to her mother, honest, uncertain, pleading for guidance, and in return received the Empress's stern counsel to charm, to obey, to win her husband's trust and France's heart. It was advice that sounded simple, but in the labyrinth of Versailles, love itself had rules and punishments. Still, she tried. She rode in the gardens at dawn, laughed with her ladies, learned the steps of French dances until they felt like breathing. She smiled for courtiers who wished her ill, offered kindness to those who sought advantage. For a time, it seemed enough. But in quiet moments, when candles burned low and the corridors emptied, she felt the stillness press close. She could hear her own footsteps echo along marble floors, could feel how far she had come from the warmth of Vienna, Even at 15, she understood that a crown is not given, it is endured. And though she could not yet name it, something within her knew that this palace of light held its own kind of darkness, the kind that does not frighten, only waits. Gardens of glass. Spring arrived in Versailles with blossoms that seemed endless, and beneath skies the color of soft porcelain, Marie Antoinette was crowned Queen of France. The bells of Notre Dame rang for hours, and the crowds filled the streets to see her carriage pass, a young queen radiant in pearls and satin, the living emblem of a nation's hope. For a time, it seemed as though France adored her. Courtiers praised her beauty, artists painted her likeness, poets compared her to dawn itself. Versailles, which had grown weary under old age and scandal, came alive again with her laughter. Her presence softened the palace, its corridors filled once more with music, its gardens alive with youth. Yet the court she ruled was both glittering and merciless. To please it was to perform endlessly, to charm, to dazzle, to never falter. So she turned to joy as her armor. She danced, played cards, attended balls that shimmered until dawn. Each new gown outshone the last. Clouds of silk, rivers of lace, colors no one had dared before. Her hair rose in elaborate towers, adorned with jewels, feathers, even ships in miniature. Paris copied her every whim, and the court adored her for it, for a time. But amid all that brilliance, there were moments of stillness she longed for, moments without ceremony or watchful eyes. So beyond the palace walls, at the edge of Versailles, she built her refuge, the Petit Trianon, a small estate of marble and quiet gardens, hidden among trees and roses. There she walked without attendants, tended flowers, rode horses through meadows, and laughed freely with a few chosen friends. They called her Antoinette there, not Your Majesty, and for a few hours each day, she felt human again. Later, another dream rose beside it, the Hameau de la Reine, her little village of cottages and orchards where milkmaids and shepherds wandered through sunlit fields. Critics would mock it as play acting, but for her, it was a memory of peace, a place untouched by the weight of crown or court. Her marriage, too, found warmth at last. Years of awkward distance slowly gave way to tenderness, and at last, the long-awaited joy arrived. Children, heirs, life renewed. First, a daughter, Marie-Therese. Then the Dauphin, the future Louis XVII. In the nursery, laughter echoed where suspicion once lingered, and when she held her children, she felt her purpose finally take shape. But beyond the palace gates, France was changing. The air itself seemed to tremble with unrest, harvests failing, debt mounting, murmurs rising in the streets. The world she ruled glittered like glass, dazzling, fragile, and easily shattered. Yet within her gardens, she tried to believe that beauty could hold back the storm, that if she smiled brightly enough, if she lived with grace, if she loved her family well, the world outside would forgive her for being its queen. As twilight settled across the fountains, she often lingered at the windows of Petit Trianon, watching fireflies dance over the lawns, listening to the faraway hum of the palace. And somewhere in that soft silence, she might have sensed it, the faint tremor that comes before glass breaks. bread and blame. Beyond the gilded gates of Versailles, hunger was rising. Fields lay dry, grain prices soared, and in the narrow streets of Paris, the scent of bread became rarer with each passing week. Mothers waited in lines before bakeries that never opened. Fathers left with empty hands. And as bellies starved, anger found a name to fill them: Marie Antoinette. Inside the palace, she still hosted concerts, masked balls, and evenings of laughter. Not from cruelty, but from habit, the life of a queen was bound to ritual, and Versailles could not simply stop glittering. Yet to the people, every jewel she wore, every candle that burned, became proof of indifference. Pamphlets appeared in the city, crude drawings, mocking verses, false tales that spread faster than truth could follow. They called her Madame Deficit, the foreign queen who spent while France starved. Then came the words that would never leave her name: let them eat cake. No document bore them. No witness ever heard her say them. The phrase had existed long before her birth, yet now it clung to her as though carved in stone. To those beyond Versailles, it was the perfect story, a single sentence to embody their fury. And though she never spoke it, it echoed louder than any truth could reach. She gave to charity when she could, sent funds to hospitals, to orphanages, to those displaced by famine. But her gifts were lost in the noise, unseen by those who needed them most. For the France she ruled had already split in two, one of silk and chandeliers, the other of cold and hunger. Inside the palace, she began to sense the change. Where once there had been flattery, there was caution. Courtiers bowed more deeply, spoke less freely. In the corridors, servants averted their eyes, and in salons across Paris, philosophers spoke of liberty, of equality, of a world without crowns. Letters from Vienna grew anxious. Her mother's once proud tone now edged with worry. She warned her daughter to be prudent, to restore dignity to a monarchy that seemed to waver with each passing month. But the young queen, surrounded by ceremony and constraint, could do little more than play her part. At night, she stood by her window, listening to the wind rustle through the trees of Versailles. It sounded different now, rougher, heavier, carrying a murmur she could not name. Beyond the walls, the people of France were no longer whispering. They were shouting. And still the palace shone. The fountains sparkled, the music played, the mirrors caught and scattered the candlelight. It was all so beautiful and so fragile. For while Versailles still glittered, France had begun to burn. The Diamond Snare. In the summer of 1785, a glimmering trap began to close around the Queen of France. It started not in Versailles, but in the salons of Paris, with a necklace unlike any the kingdom had ever seen. 600 diamonds, arranged like captured light, crafted years before for another queen. When that queen died before it could be sold, the jeweler sought a buyer worthy of its splendor, and none seemed more fitting than Marie Antoinette. But she refused it. Even in her love for beauty, she knew its price was too heavy, its timing too cruel for a country in debt. Still, greed and deceit found a way to bring her name into its glittering web. A woman named Jeanne de la Motte, clever and dangerous in her charm, claimed closeness to the queen. To To a cardinal eager to restore his place in court, she whispered promises, that Marie Antoinette longed for his favor, that she wished for the necklace in secret, and that he could deliver it to her through discreet hands. Letters were forged, meetings arranged in shadowed gardens, and the cardinal believed every word. When the jewelers placed the masterpiece into his care, it was handed over not to a queen, but to thieves who cut it apart and vanished into the world. When the scheme unraveled, it did so with cruel perfection. Paris buzzed with accusation, and the queen's name was at its center. The cardinal was arrested, Jean fled, and the court turned into a stage of humiliation. Though Marie Antoinette was proven innocent, it no longer mattered. The people believed what they wished to believe, that the foreign queen had conspired to spend a fortune while her subjects starved. The trial became a spectacle. Pamphlets flooded the streets, mocking her, painting her as deceitful, proud, heartless. In taverns, her face was drawn on playing cards. In alleys, her name was cursed beneath the same moon that once lit her gardens. The verdict of the court cleared her, but the verdict of France condemned her. From that moment, something shifted in the air of Versailles. It was no longer laughter that followed her through the halls, but murmurs. Each curtsy seemed colder, each conversation shorter. The courtiers who once basked in her favor began to keep their distance, as though her presence carried danger. She, who had once been the embodiment of France's grandeur, was now its most convenient villain. Her innocence meant little against the tide of resentment. And though the diamonds had long been broken and sold, the story of their theft gleamed on, brighter, sharper, crueler than any truth could shine. Beyond the mirrors and marble, beyond the perfume and silks, the kingdom's patience had thinned to thread. And Marie Antoinette, standing before her reflection, saw not a queen, but a target already marked by fate. Revolution's first flames. The year was 1789, and the air in France trembled with something that no one could name, but everyone could feel. It began as talk, in cafes, in meeting halls, in the very streets where bread had become a luxury. Words like rights and freedom drifted through the air, strange and powerful as incantations. And soon talk turned into movement, movement into fury. Inside Versailles, the queen heard the noise grow distant and near all at once. Letters arrived daily, some pleading, others threatening. The Estates General had been called for the first time in over 100 years, and with it came demands that no crown could easily grant. She watched her husband struggle under the weight of decisions no man could carry alone. He hesitated, hoped, waited, while the world outside moved faster than hesitation could follow. When the Bastille fell that July, the thunder reached even the mirrored halls. It was not just a fortress that had fallen, but the illusion of safety. Beyond the palace gates, mobs gathered, no longer murmuring but roaring. In the salons of Paris, noble families packed their belongings and fled, leaving behind the perfumes of a dying age. By October, the fury had found its way to the Queen's doorstep. Thousands of women, cold, starving, determined, marched from Paris to Versailles under gray skies and pouring rain. They came for bread, for justice, for the Queen herself. The sound of their arrival echoed through the marble corridors. Drums, shouts, the endless beat of feet against stone. As dawn broke, they forced their way through the gates. Guards were slain, doors shattered, tapestries torn from the walls. The queen fled from her chambers barefoot, clutching her children in terror. When the crowd demanded her appearance, she stepped onto the balcony, pale, trembling, but unflinching. Before her stretched an ocean of faces, angry, hungry, human. She bowed her head, and for a heartbeat, the crowd fell silent. It did not last. By day's end, she and the royal family were forced to leave Versailles. The carriages rolled toward Paris, surrounded by the same people who once cheered their wedding. Now they shouted insults, carried pikes, and waved torn banners through the wind. As the palace faded behind her, she turned once more to see its rooftops glint in the cold light. The fountains no longer danced. The music had stopped. Versailles, her golden world, her prison of splendor, was no longer hers. And as the wheels of the carriage creaked toward the city, Marie Antoinette understood what she had never believed possible. The revolution had begun, and it would not end until it had devoured its queen. Captive in the Tuileries, Paris was no longer a city of light for the queen. It was a cage made of stone and noise. The Tuileries Palace, once a royal residence, became her prison, its tall windows looking out upon streets that had turned against her. Guards stood at every door, rifles gleaming beneath flickering lanterns. Crowds gathered daily, shouting insults through the gates, hurling words sharper than blades. Inside, the queen tried to hold on to the fragments of her world. She taught her children lessons in secret, mended their clothes with trembling hands, and wrote letters that would never reach their destination. Her husband, once King of France, sat for hours in silence, the weight of indecision heavy on his shoulders. In that quiet, she became the stronger of the two, steady, composed, outwardly calm. But when night fell, and the sounds of the city grew distant, tears found her easily. She was no longer surrounded by courtiers or friends, only watchers, only suspicion. The laughter of Versailles seemed like a dream from another life, fading with each tick of the clock. Still, she did not surrender to despair. In her letters to foreign allies and loyalists, she pleaded for rescue, for restoration, for hope. Then came the attempt to flee, the last fragile thread of escape. In June of 1791, disguised as commoners, the royal family slipped from the palace under the cover of night. Carriages rolled through the countryside, wheels creaking softly, hearts pounding with fear and longing. But fate, ever unkind, had set its eyes upon them. At Versailles, they were recognized, stopped, surrounded, betrayed. When soldiers escorted them back to Paris, the journey felt endless. No crowds cheered now, only silence, heavy and condemning. The faces that lined the streets no longer saw a family, but a fallen monarchy being dragged home in shame. Back in the Tuileries, the walls felt closer, colder. The guards no longer bowed, they stared. Each day brought new decrees from the assembly, stripping the crown of its power, one law at a time. Each night, she sat by candlelight, writing letters in code, her hands steady even as her world disintegrated around her. She had once been a queen adored for her beauty, envied for her grace. Now she was a prisoner, a foreigner in the country that had once crowned her. Still, beneath that pale composure, her will remained fierce. For though she could not change her fate, she would meet it with dignity. And as the wind rattled the windows of her captivity, she lifted her eyes toward the flicker of the candle before her. Its flame bent, wavered, but it did not die. The Guillotine's Waltz. The summer of 1792 tore away the last illusion of safety. Crowds stormed the Tuileries, red flags rising like fire against the pale sky. The palace that had held the Queen captive became a battlefield of screams and gunfire. When the smoke cleared, the monarchy was gone, the king suspended, the crown stripped, the family taken as prisoners of the nation they once ruled. They were brought to the temple, a gray tower of stone and silence. Here, days lost their names, and time moved like a slow tide. The queen mended clothes, prayed softly, and watched her children grow thinner with each passing week. When Louis was taken away for trial, she knew she would never see him again. That January, the blade fell, and the kingdom that had once crowned her now rejoiced in his death. After his execution, her title was erased, no longer Majesty, but Widow Capet. Still, she carried herself as a queen, even when surrounded by guards who mocked and spat at her feet. In the dim cell where she slept, she could hear the chants of the crowds outside, the rhythm of drums, the sound of a city feeding on its own fury. Letters to her sister in Vienna went unanswered, messengers vanished, allies turned away in fear. Her last comfort was her son, but even that mercy was stolen. He was taken from her arms, placed under the care of men who swore to make him forget his name. In the gray dawn of October 16, 1793, they came for her. She dressed with care, in a plain white gown, her hair shorn short. When they bound her hands, she did not resist. The cart carried her through streets she had once traveled in glory. Now, the same people who once cheered her marriage shouted curses as she passed. She did not weep. She did not look away. At the Place de la Révolution, the guillotine stood waiting, red against the sky. She climbed the wooden steps alone, her pale face calm beneath the autumn light. No speech could save her, no mercy could be found, only the final stillness of fate fulfilled. As the blade fell, the crowd erupted. Some cried, some laughed, all watched. And just like that, the Queen of France was no more. When night came, the city quieted again. The streets were damp with rain, the air heavy with smoke and sorrow. Yet somewhere in that silence, a strange peace lingered, not for France, not for the revolution, but for her. For the woman who had once been crowned beneath crystal chandeliers, and who now belonged to history itself. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave, her name stained and her story twisted. But centuries later, the world would learn again what the mob could not see, that beneath the crown, beneath the legend, there had always been a woman, a wife, a mother, a queen who danced toward the guillotine, and gave her life to the throne that had already betrayed her. Queen Anne Boleyn of England, the queen who paid the price of a king's desire. Hever's Rosebud. In the heart of Kent, nestled among gentle meadows and winding rivers, stood Hever Castle, quiet, serene, and far removed from the schemes of courts and crowns. Within its walls, in the spring of 1501, a girl was born who would one day alter the course of England. Her name was Anne Boleyn. She was the daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn and Lady Elizabeth Howard, a family of ambition yet not of royal blood. The castle's ivy-clad towers looked down upon orchards that bloomed like painted dreams, and it was there that Anne's earliest laughter was heard. She was quick-minded, spirited, and curious, a child who watched the world not with meekness, but with a quiet fire behind her eyes. Her father, ever mindful of opportunity, saw that spark and knew it would not stay hidden long. As she grew, Anne's days were filled with the soft murmur of tutors and the scent of candle wax over parchment. She learned her letters, her music, her prayers. But she also learned grace, how to move, to speak, to hold her gaze when spoken to by those above her. Each lesson was a seed, sown carefully for the life her family imagined she would lead. Yet beyond the stone walls, England itself was changing. The court of Henry VII gave way to his son, a new monarch, full of vigor and vanity, and the kingdom seemed to stir from its long winter. When Anne was still young, her father's service to the crown brought him favor and new connections. And so, like many daughters of noble families, Anne was sent abroad, first to the Netherlands, and then to France. It was not uncommon for girls of good breeding to learn refinement in foreign courts. But for Anne, this journey was more than education, it was awakening. France, in the early years of the 16th century, shimmered with culture and conversation. The young English girl, observant and sharp, found herself amidst the grace of Queen Claude's household, surrounded by the poetry of chivalry and the elegance of Renaissance thought. She listened, she absorbed, she adapted. French women spoke with wit as easily as they walked in silks, and Anne learned to do the same. The music of the French tongue, the art of measured charm, all became part of her. Gone was the quiet child of Hever. In her place stood a young woman of presence. She was not the fairest of her peers, yet she drew attention with her manner, an intelligence that lit her expression, a confidence that unsettled those unused to such poise in a woman. It was said that her dark eyes held secrets, not of deceit, but of awareness. She saw and remembered. Still, beneath that composure, she remained the rosebud of Hever, tender, untested, her petals yet to meet the storms that would one day strip her bare. When she returned to England after years abroad, she brought with her not only elegance but a quiet ambition, not for power, but for a place in a world that so rarely made room for women of mind and will. In the calm of her family's estate, she walked again by the water's edge, her reflection glimmering on the still surface. The castle seemed smaller now, the air quieter, her world both familiar and distant. She could not have known then that this tranquil home would one day stand as the beginning of her legend, the soil where innocence took root before destiny came to claim its bloom. And so, from the quiet gardens of Hever, a story began, of charm and danger, of love and ruin, a story that would draw kings to madness and kingdoms to fracture. But for now, she was still just and bright, unknowing, and beautiful in her first spring. Hever's rosebud, waiting to unfold beneath the sun of a merciless crown. Courts of charm and chance. By the time Anne returned to England, the air around the Tudor court had changed. The reign of Henry VIII shimmered with music, laughter, and restless ambition. Courtiers danced beneath gilded ceilings, their silks whispering secrets across the polished floors of Whitehall. In this world of elegance and danger, Anne Boleyn stepped lightly, neither royal nor common, but something altogether more intriguing. Her family, ever attuned to opportunity, placed her first in service to Queen Catherine of Aragon. The Spanish queen was gracious and devout, adored by her people, though shadows of disappointment had begun to fall over her marriage. Years of miscarriages, no surviving sons. England, ever hungry for succession, began to murmur. Yet in Catherine's household, and found both a stage and a lesson. She watched the Queen, the patience in her words, the quiet dignity she held in the face of the King's wandering eye, and listened to courtiers flatter and deceive, watched favors won and lost in the space of a glance. She learned when to speak and when to remain silent, when to smile and when to look away. These were not lessons written in books, but truths whispered through the corridors of power. Her time in France had honed her wit. Here it began to serve her. At court masques, she moved with unstudied grace, her dark hair gleaming beneath candlelight. Those who saw her found themselves drawn not by beauty alone, but by presence, that rare, intoxicating mix of intellect and charm that lingered after she left a room. Her laughter, bright but measured, became something men remembered, yet and did not seek to be remembered. Not yet. Her heart then belonged to another, Henry Percy, heir to the Earl of Northumberland. They spoke softly in gardens, exchanged glances that dared to dream beyond the limits of rank. But dreams at court seldom last. The union was deemed impossible. Percy was promised elsewhere, and Anne's ambition, however faint at the time, made such defiance dangerous. When the lovers were separated by command, Anne's tears fell quietly behind closed doors, and in their place, something colder began to take root, resolve. Whispers began to follow her, the French-bred lady with opinions too sharp, eyes too knowing. Some called her bold, others improper. Yet even her detractors could not deny her allure. In a court where many women were ornaments, and became an enigma, and so it was that King Henry VIII noticed her. Not at once, not with thunder, but with curiosity. She was unlike the others who sought his favor. She did not flutter nor plead. She spoke with clarity, laughed without simpering, and when his gaze lingered, she met it briefly, and then turned away. That small defiance struck him like flint to steel. He had been adored by many, resisted by none. But Anne Boleyn, clever, cultured, and confident, was something new. At night, when music drifted through the palace halls, and would look upon the Queen, dignified, devout, weary, and feel a strange mix of admiration and pity. She knew that beneath the silks and prayers, Catherine's heart carried years of disappointment, and somewhere deep within Anne's own heart, a voice stirred. Would she ever love, truly love, in a world where affection was a currency, and women its coin? Still, she smiled when the king's letters began to arrive. Careful words cloaked in courtesy, yet heavy with intent. She read them in silence, folded them neatly, and tucked them away. For Anne Boleyn had learned something in her brief life, that every gaze, every word, every choice was a step upon a path. And hers, though still unseen, was leading her toward both the summit of power and the brink of ruin. The court was a game of charm and chance, and Anne had just placed her first wager. The King's Pursuit. The letters grew bolder. What began as polite admiration soon deepened into a steady flame. King Henry VIII, master of kingdoms and conqueror of men, found himself conquered instead by a woman who would not yield. Anne Boleyn's refusal to become his mistress became the spark that set his world ablaze. At first, Anne avoided him with a grace that only enticed him further. She excused herself from court, returning to Hever under the guise of modest retreat. But even from afar, her absence was a presence. Henry's messengers came bearing jewels, poetry, and declarations of love written in his own hand. His passion, once fleeting for others, turned relentless for her. Anne's reply was always measured, respectful, never submissive. She thanked the king for his favor, but reminded him that her honor was not for sale. It was not pride alone that guided her. She knew what became of women who surrendered too easily to royal affection. They rose in a moment and fell in disgrace, their names forgotten once the king's eye wandered elsewhere, and would not be one of them. And so the dance began, a pursuit drawn out not of cruelty, but of calculation and self-preservation. Henry's desire transformed from whim to obsession. He promised her everything, a crown, a future, even a new world where she would stand beside him as queen. Yet England had a queen already, Catherine of Aragon, his wife of nearly 20 years, devout, patient, unyielding. The court buzzed with gossip. Some admired Anne's resolve, others whispered that she bewitched the king. Foreign ambassadors wrote home of her black and beautiful eyes, her sharp words that both delighted and unnerved. The courtiers, watching carefully, began to choose sides, those loyal to Catherine, and those who saw in and the tide of change. And herself was caught between fear and fascination. Henry was not a man easily denied, yet she saw in him something dangerous, a hunger for what he could not have, and a temper that could turn love into fury in an instant. Still, she held her ground. Her letters stayed cool, her presence distant, and the king, accustomed to surrender, became desperate. When Anne returned to court, she found herself surrounded by gifts, pearls, silks, and a diamond heart set with the motto "Declare I dare not." The irony was not lost on her. Henry's passion had grown into something greater, an ambition to make her his queen, no matter the cost. Years passed in this dangerous limbo. Catherine remained steadfast, refusing to yield her title or her vows. The Pope hesitated, torn between Henry's demands and the will of Spain. Yet the king's resolve only hardened. He began to see Anne not as temptation, but as destiny, the woman through whom his line would be reborn. And meanwhile, began to glimpse what her acceptance might mean. To be queen was not to be free, it was to be bound ever more tightly to a man and a nation's fate. Yet her heart, long guarded, began to soften. She saw in Henry not just power, but yearning for legacy, for love, for something that could not be found in duty alone. And so, after years of resistance, Anne's defenses began to yield. Not in surrender, but in belief that perhaps by standing beside him, she could shape a better England. But kings do not change for love, they change for need. And Henry's need would soon tear apart not only a marriage, but a kingdom itself. For what began as a pursuit of desire would soon become a war for the soul of England. Kingdoms torn for desire. By the late 1520s, the king's pursuit of Anne Boleyn had grown into something far larger than passion. It had become a question of empire, of faith, of who ruled the soul of England itself. To love her was no longer merely desire, it was defiance. And Henry, once the church's golden sun, now stood at war with Rome, and watched as the storm gathered, each wind of scandal and debate swirling around her name. She had not asked to be England's cause, yet here she stood, the woman for whom a king would risk excommunication, rebellion, and eternal damnation. Priests thundered from pulpits, calling her the serpent in paradise. Pamphlets traveled across Europe, condemning her as enchantress, heretic, destroyer of queens. But within the gilded halls of court, Henry called her my most beloved, and swore the crown itself would bend to her. The king's great matter, as it came to be known, was no simple affair. For years he petitioned the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, claiming it was cursed by God for having once been his brother's wife. Yet Rome, bound to Catherine's powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V, refused him. The Pope delayed, evaded, denied, and the king grew restless. It was then that Anne's influence deepened. Her education in France, her interest in reformist thought, all these began to shape her counsel. She shared books by Tyndale and Luther, spoke of Scripture not as rebellion, but as revelation. Henry, ever eager to see his will sanctified, listened, and thus, inch by inch, a monarch's love became the hammer that cracked the centuries-old bond between England and the Church of Rome. By 1533, years of waiting and whispers came to an end, and, after long resistance, was finally wed to Henry in secret. Catherine was cast aside, her title stripped, her chambers emptied. The Pope's fury was met with indifference, for Henry had declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. No foreign power would dictate his conscience, nor his crown. When Anne was crowned queen at Westminster Abbey that summer, the streets filled with both celebration and unease. Gold and crimson banners fluttered, trumpets sounded, yet beneath the music lay murmurs that this was not triumph but usurpation. Still, Anne carried herself with radiant composure. Dressed in purple velvet, a train of ermine flowing behind her, she was every inch a queen, her face serene, her eyes bright with victory and the fragile hope that all this struggle would now bring peace. In those early months, Henry doted on her endlessly. She was granted estates, jewels, honors beyond measure. Her family rose in rank. Her father became an earl, her brother a viscount. The court sparkled with new favor, and yet, among the courtiers, resentment took root. Those loyal to Catherine called her the concubine, and even her allies whispered that she must soon deliver what England demanded, a son, and believed it would come. She believed, after all the years of trial, that heaven would bless her union. In the chill of September 1533, she gave birth, and when the midwife lifted the swaddled child and smiled through tears. But then came the words that changed everything. It was not a prince, it was a daughter, Elizabeth. For a moment, Henry masked his disappointment with forced cheer, calling her God's greatest gift, but the truth was written in his silence, and cradled her infant, kissed her brow, and whispered promises she would never see fulfilled. She did not yet know that this small red-haired girl would one day reign as one of England's greatest monarchs. For now, all Anne saw was a crown trembling on her own head, and a husband whose love was beginning to flicker beneath the weight of unmet desire. Still, she smiled, radiant and unbroken, as the bells of London rang to honor the newborn princess, unaware that, even in that moment of triumph, her enemies were already sharpening their knives. For kingdoms may be torn for desire, but they are never rebuilt for love. Queen amid tempest. The first months of Anne's queenship glimmered like a fever dream. Banquets, triumphs, songs, all proclaiming the rise of a new age and a new queen. Yet beneath the gilded joy, the court trembled. The people, once dazzled by her wit and grace, now whispered her name with scorn. The concubine, they called her, the woman who brought down a queen and a faith, and had gained her crown, but not her peace. The burden of expectation weighed upon her shoulders like gold turned to iron. Each morning she rose with the same silent prayer, that her next child would be a son. For only a boy could secure her place, silence her enemies, and steady Henry's wavering affection. But heaven seemed deaf to her pleas. Her next pregnancies ended in sorrow, one miscarriage, then another, and with each loss, the king's warmth cooled a little more. The laughter that once filled their chambers became rare. The same man who had torn kingdoms for her began to seek comfort elsewhere. At court, Anne's enemies grew bold. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, turned cautious and cold. He saw that the Queen's sharp tongue, once her greatest weapon, was now her peril. She quarreled with Henry over policy, over his mistresses, over her place beside him. And though she remained clever, brave, unflinching, her very brilliance became her danger. Still, she did not bend, and attended to her duties with poise, her eyes bright beneath jeweled headdresses, her words cutting but never careless. She took joy where she could, in her daughter Elizabeth, the one soul who loved her without condition. The child, red-haired and quick-minded, was the image of both her parents. When Anne held her, she felt a flicker of the peace that had once lived in Hever's gardens. But the court was a storm without mercy. Catherine of Aragon's death in January of 1536 should have brought security, yet instead, it deepened Anne's peril. For Henry no longer needed to justify his divorce to Rome. The old queen was gone, and his conscience with her. Worse still, a new face appeared at court. Jane Seymour, gentle, quiet, everything and was not. Henry's gaze began to wander once again, and the court could sense it. Cromwell, ever the pragmatist, recognized his master's shifting heart and saw in it opportunity. Anne, proud and outspoken, had crossed too many powerful men, and in the volatile kingdom she helped create, There was no room for a queen who divided loyalty instead of uniting it. Still, Anne tried to regain her place, with wit, with music, with the same grace that once captivated a king. But her efforts only fanned his irritation. "You will try to govern me," Henry once said to her, his voice colder than winter glass. And though she answered with silence, she knew something within him had changed. That spring, she suffered another miscarriage, this time a son. The blow was cruel beyond words. Henry's disappointment turned to something darker, and his courtiers sensed it like a shift in the wind. Anne's crown, once glittering with promise, now trembled on her brow. Even so, she walked among the courtiers with her head held high, her composure unbroken. Those who watched her could not decide whether she was brave or blind, but Anne herself knew. She had fought too long, given too much to surrender now. And yet, somewhere deep in her heart, she could feel it, the gathering of the tempest, the slow, unseen turn of fortune. The moment when desire's fire begins to burn not for love, but for ruin. Web of Thorns. By 1536, Anne's world had shifted from triumph to peril. The court, once enchanted by her wit and charm, now plotted quietly in corners where tapestries muted their schemes. Thomas Cromwell, once her protector, had become cautious, watching every move with the keen eye of a man who understood that a queen's fortune could vanish as swiftly as a candle's flame, and could feel it, the subtle tilts of conversation, the carefully measured smiles that carried venom beneath their surface. Courtiers whispered of her supposed indiscretions, her pride, her ambition. Rumors of adultery and witchcraft began to circulate, seeded carefully, and yet impossible to ignore. The very allies who once praised her now spoke in double meanings, cautious of their own survival. Henry's affection, once fierce and consuming, had cooled. He no longer sought her company with ardor, his visits brief, his attention divided, and tried to maintain her composure, hiding the tension in polite conversation, in measured bows, in careful glances. Yet even her poise could not shield her from the growing storm. Cromwell maneuvered behind the scenes, gathering testimony, shaping narrative, readying the charges that would soon be impossible to refute. Anne's enemies multiplied. The men she had once charmed, once outwitted, now conspired in silence, each seeking favor with a king whose passions had grown restless. Even her own ladies-in-waiting were forced to choose between loyalty and self-preservation. In these months, Anne often wandered the palace gardens alone, the cold stone beneath her fingers, the wind tangling her hair. She thought of Hever, of quiet mornings among the roses, and wondered how innocence could ever survive in a world of ambition and deceit. She clutched her daughter Elizabeth close, the child's red hair like fire against her chest, a reminder of both triumph and vulnerability. It was in the summer of 1536 that the charges crystallized. Adultery, incest, treason, accusations spun from whispers and fear, carefully orchestrated to ensure that no one could defend her without risking their own ruin. Even Henry's advisors urged swift action, their eyes calculating, their tongues cautious. The king, for all his former devotion, did not protest. The court had been prepared, the trap set, and Anne had walked unknowingly into its center. Her arrest came in May. Guards entered her apartments quietly, their faces expressionless, and was taken to the Tower of London, the familiar stones now a place of confinement instead of refuge. She was allowed little comfort, her letters closely monitored, her visitors few and fearful. The palace that once echoed with her laughter now seemed a distant memory, a reminder of how swiftly favor can turn to peril. And so Anne Boleyn, the woman who had changed the course of a kingdom, who had inspired reform and defiance, now found herself ensnared in a web of thorns. Each accusation, each betrayal, each carefully calculated lie was a thread, and together they formed a cage from which there could be no escape. For in the palace of power, beauty and brilliance can protect only so long, and even queens must bow to the sharpness of ambition and the cruelty of men who fear the very light they once adored. Tower without pity. Anne Boleyn's arrival at the Tower of London marked the beginning of her final chapter. The gates closed behind her with a solemn clang, echoing through corridors that had seen centuries of prisoners, conspirators, and king's enemies alike. Here, in the cold stone halls and narrow chambers, her life would be measured not by triumph or charm, but by endurance and silence. The charges against her, adultery, incest, treason, were laid with precision, each accusation carefully chosen to terrify and shame. There was no trial that promised mercy, no counsel that could weigh truth over convenience. And once the center of England's power, now found herself stripped of all but her wits and dignity. Days blurred into nights as she awaited judgment. Guards passed with impassive faces, their footsteps echoing like the ticking of an inescapable clock. Letters she wrote were intercepted, messages she received were filtered, and every friend who once smiled openly now approached in fear, knowing that proximity could mean ruin. Even her father and brother, though loyal, had to temper counsel with caution. Anne's mind wandered to Elizabeth, her daughter, left in the care of servants who whispered reassurances but could not fill a mother's absence. The red-haired child, a spark of life amidst the cold walls, became Anne's tether to sanity. She imagined her future, imagined Elizabeth walking these same corridors one day as queen, and drew courage from the thought. The trial, held in May of 1536, was swift and merciless. The evidence was thin, fabricated in places, exaggerated in others, yet the court's judgment required neither truth nor proof. Witnesses testified against her with rehearsed precision, many of them coerced, many fearful of the king's wrath. Every word spoken in the hall of judgment pressed upon and like a hammer, shaping her fate with inevitability. Anne's composure never faltered. She stood tall, her eyes clear, her voice calm when addressed. She spoke little, answered each question with careful thought, yet in silence conveyed the weight of her innocence. It mattered not. The machinery of power had decided, and even the brightest mind could not turn the wheel of a kingdom gone mad with suspicion and ambition. In the Tower, and reflected on the years that had brought her here, Hever's Gardens, the courts of France, the king's pursuit, the coronation, the birth of Elizabeth. Each memory was a thread of gold in the tapestry of her life, now juxtaposed against the iron bars and narrow windows that imprisoned her. Even beauty, wit, and courage were powerless against the convergence of envy, fear, and desire. And so, Anne awaited her fate in the Tower without pity. Every sunrise was measured, every shadow examined, every footstep echoed with the knowledge that the end was near. Yet in that chamber of stone, she retained her dignity, her mind sharp, and her resolve intact. The crown she had once dreamed of now felt both distant and inevitable. For even queens, when betrayed by the throne and abandoned by fortune, must face the final reckoning alone. May's silent grace. The morning of May the 19th, 1536, broke quietly over London. Mist clung to the Thames, curling around bridges and riverbanks, softening the city's edges as if the world itself hesitated to witness what was to come. In the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn rose with measured calm, her gown of black velvet flowing behind her like a shadow of the queen she once was. No screams, no last desperate pleas, only quiet preparation, the steady hands of attendants who understood the ritual of finality. Anne's hair was bound, her face serene, her dark eyes reflecting not fear, but comprehension. She had known this day in its essence, long before it arrived. The accusations, the betrayal, the king's fading desire, all had led to this precise moment. She walked to the scaffold with grace unbroken. The crowd murmured below, curious and cruel, yet she met none of their stares. Anne's thoughts were of her daughter Elizabeth, safely tucked away, unaware that her mother's life would end before she could understand its price. The future queen, she hoped, would be spared the treacheries of power that had claimed so many before her. The air was heavy with spring warmth and the scent of blossoms. Birds sang from the nearby trees, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding just beyond the walls. Anne breathed deeply, feeling the sunlight on her skin one last time, a fleeting brush of life against the inevitability of death. She stepped upon the scaffold, her heels clicking softly on the wooden boards, each sound echoing in the still morning. She faced the executioner, a man trained for precision, his axe sharp, his motions practiced, and knelt, bowed her head, and whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for her daughter, for England, for the dreams and dangers she had once dared to hold close. In her final moments, there was no anger, no accusation, only a quiet acceptance of the fate she had met with courage. The blade fell with a clean, decisive motion. Gasps and cries rose from the crowd, but Anne's legacy had already passed beyond their reach. She had altered the course of a kingdom, defied a king, and borne a daughter who would one day rule England with wisdom and strength. Her life, stolen too soon, became a story of ambition, love, betrayal, and unwavering resolve. Even in death, she carried the dignity that had marked her throughout life. The Tower, once a place of confinement, now held her memory, her courage, and the quiet grace of a queen who faced the throne's betrayal with unwavering strength. May's silent grace marked not an end, but a passage, the final chapter of Anne Boleyn, the queen who paid the price of a king's desire, and whose spirit would endure in the crown she had once touched and the daughter she had left behind. Queen Mary Stuart of Scotland, the monarch of broken alliances. Falkland's fragile dawn. Mary Stuart was born in the cold dawn of December 1942 at Linlithgow Palace, a place where stone walls held centuries of history and the chill of Scottish winters seeped into every chamber. At just 6 days old, she was crowned Queen of Scotland, an infant monarch in a land of turbulent loyalties and restless nobles. Her tiny hands, barely strong enough to grasp, already held a destiny shaped by crowns and betrayal. The palace hummed with quiet urgency as regents and counselors debated her future, their voices measured, sharp with ambition. Each noble saw in Mary the possibility of power, a pawn or a prize depending on who could control her wardship. She slept beneath layers of silk and linen, her cradle tucked near the hearth, while advisors whispered of alliances, rivalries, and the fragile stability of a kingdom that had never known peace. Mary's earliest memories, though shrouded in infancy, were surrounded by the rituals of royalty, servants moving silently through corridors, the distant echo of clanging doors, and the scent of fires burning day and night. Her mother, Mary of Guise, watched over her with a mixture of tenderness and calculation, aware that every gesture, every lullaby, every glance could shape the perception of this tiny queen in the eyes of a suspicious court. Even as a baby, Mary was not simply a child. She was a symbol, a living embodiment of Scotland's hopes and fears. Nobles plotted quietly in the halls, each alliance forged with promises that could be broken as easily as snowflakes scattered by the wind. The infant queen, oblivious to intrigue, was both sovereign and prey, a jewel in the hands of those who would steer her life for their own gain. Her early years were spent moving between castles, tutored by regents who balanced lessons in Latin, religion, and diplomacy with the subtle art of obedience and restraint. She learned, even in silence, that power was delicate, fleeting, and that the hands meant to protect her could also ensnare her. Her cradle at Falkland became a throne in miniature, a stage where ambition danced unseen, and where trust was a dangerous currency. Through winter nights, the young Mary slept as Scotland shifted around her. Alliances formed, rebel factions schemed, and regents argued over the smallest detail of her upbringing. And though she could not yet understand, her life was already entwined with the patterns of loyalty and betrayal that would define her every step. In those fragile dawns, she lay swaddled and unaware, the crown she could not yet wear heavy with promise and peril. The whispers of nobles, the flickering torchlight along stone corridors, and the cold Scottish air that crept beneath her blanket were the first intimations of a world where beauty, birth, and blood would be tested by ambition and treachery. For even from the very beginning, Mary Stuart's life was not hers alone. It belonged to a kingdom, to its restless nobles, and to the invisible hands that would shape her destiny long before she could walk, speak, or decide for herself. French elegance, hidden lessons. At the age of 5, Mary Stuart left the misty hills and cold stone walls of Scotland behind, traveling to the gilded halls of France, where sunlight spilled over gardens that seemed endless, and fountains sang with the laughter of courtiers. The journey itself was long and uncertain, a procession through kingdoms and rivers, escorted by nobles whose eyes were always calculating, measuring the infant queen's worth against alliances and dowries. The French court embraced her as both treasure and curiosity, a Scottish jewel transplanted into a world of silk, perfume, and whispered intrigue. She was placed under the careful watch of tutors, governesses, and ladies-in-waiting, all tasked with shaping her into a princess worthy of French kings and princes. Yet none could entirely shield her from the subtle dangers of court life. In these golden halls, Mary began to learn the language of power without speaking a word, the delicate bow that commanded respect, the quiet glance that could convey approval or warning, the careful listening that revealed more than any answer. She learned that elegance was armor and charm was a shield, yet both were fragile and easily pierced by envy or rumor. As she grew, Mary observed the subtle currents of rivalry among the courtiers. Women who smiled in her presence could turn against her in a heartbeat. Men who praised her intelligence could plot her disgrace. In those early lessons, she learned the fine line between admiration and jealousy, affection and ambition, guidance and manipulation. Every gift of clothing, every jewel pinned upon her small shoulders, seemed to carry the weight of expectation and subtle threats hidden beneath its shine. Even in play, she could not escape politics. Games of chess and marbles became exercises in observation. Who listened, who cheated, who sought advantage, and Mary watched, learning to measure trust and suspicion with a care far beyond her years. She found small delights where she could, in the scent of flowers, the warmth of the sun on her face, the soft murmur of French lullabies sung in her ear, yet the lessons of diplomacy were never far from her mind. Her time in France shaped not only her manners but her sense of herself, intelligent, observant, and capable of navigating the intricate lattice of court life. And yet, for all its beauty, the French court was a gilded cage, where every gesture and word could be turned into evidence against her, where alliances could shift like quicksilver, and where the promise of power came hand in hand with the risk of betrayal. By the time she was crowned Queen Consort of France at 15, Mary Stuart had become more than a child of royal blood. She was a student of the human heart, trained in the arts of observation, patience, and self-preservation. She had learned the truths that would serve her for years, that trust could be a weapon against you, that loyalty was often a mask for ambition, and that even the most elegant hole could hide the sharpest knife. And though she walked among the French courtiers with laughter and grace, her young mind already carried the seeds of caution, a quiet knowledge that in kingdoms gilded with beauty, every promise could be a trap, and every lesson could one day decide life or death. Throne of Two Crowns. Mary Stuart's 15th year brought a triumph that shimmered like sunlight on the Seine. Marriage to Francis II, heir to the French throne, and her ascension as Queen Consort of France. The ceremony was resplendent, with golden tapestries, the scent of roses and incense filling the air, and a court assembled to witness the union of Scottish blood and French majesty. In that moment, Mary's life seemed to promise power, influence, and a place at the center of Europe's grand stage. In France, she moved among the nobility with a grace that belied her youth. Every curtsy, every smile, every turn of her gaze was observed and calculated, for in a court of silver candlesticks and velvet gowns, reputation was a fragile crown as easily tarnished as the gold she wore. Mary's intelligence and charm won allies, yet envy was a constant companion. Whispered rivalries and subtle intrigues followed her like shadows along palace corridors. Her life as queen was a delicate balance between diplomacy and devotion. Francis, too, young and impressionable, was often guided by his advisors, leaving Mary to navigate the complex currents of influence, loyalty, and expectation on her own. She learned that power could be both intoxicating and isolating, a golden cage, beautiful to behold but impossible to escape without peril. Even the smallest gestures could carry consequences. A glance held too long, a word uttered in jest, a favor granted to one courtier over another, all could spark resentment or suspicion. Mary's early lessons in France, now amplified by her position, taught her that elegance must be matched by strategy, and kindness could be repaid with cruelty if wielded carelessly. Yet for all the dangers of the French court, there were moments of joy and triumph. She attended grand balls and feasts, rode through gardens lined with fountains, and danced in halls where music floated like sunlight. She experienced affection and camaraderie, felt the thrill of being admired not as a child or ward, but as a sovereign, a partner, a monarch in her own right. But power is never permanent. Francis's reign was brief, and Mary's time in France, though brilliant, carried the seeds of impermanence. Every alliance she built, every bond she cherished, was tethered to a throne that could shift with death, war, or betrayal. The pleasures of her queenship were intertwined with the knowledge that one day she might return to Scotland, where loyalty was scarce and danger ever present. And so, crowned in France and loved by some, envied by many, Mary Stuart began to understand that a monarch's life is a careful dance, where triumph and peril are inseparable, and where every choice can echo across kingdoms, long after the music fades. Return to a Kingdom of Storms. The year was 1560, and Mary Stuart returned to Scotland, stepping from the gilded halls of France into a land scarred by rebellion, religious strife, and fractured loyalties. The ships that carried her north cleaved through cold waters, and the wind whipped her cloak, as if Scotland itself were testing her resolve before she set foot on its soil. She arrived not as a child or bride, but as a sovereign, expected to rule a kingdom that had long suffered under the ambitions of regents and nobles. Every castle she entered, every road she traversed, spoke of a country divided. Protestant factions clashed with Catholic loyalists, and families that once swore fealty now measured her worth against the promise of their own advantage. Her advisors, once confident in their authority, whispered of plots and conspiracies that stretched like invisible webs across Edinburgh and Stirling, ready to ensnare the unwary queen who had returned too late to inherit peace. Mary's coronation in Scotland was both a triumph and a test. The crown upon her head weighed heavy with expectation and danger, reminding her that sovereignty was never simply inherited. It was claimed anew each day, in negotiations, judgments, and alliances that could fracture as quickly as they were formed. She rode through towns where the people watched her with curiosity, fear, and hope intertwined, uncertain of the young woman who had spent her youth abroad and returned to inherit both their loyalty and their suspicion. Even family brought complications. Her mother, Mary of Guise, and distant nobles shaped her counsel, their advice both counsel and caution, loyalty and calculation intertwined. Every decision Mary made, in law, in marriage, in religion, had consequences that rippled through families and factions, shaping alliances that might protect her or betray her in the same breath. In these first months, Mary felt the relentless pulse of political life, the constant need to observe, weigh, and measure. Every smile could conceal ambition, every gift could be a bribe, every compliment a warning. Scotland demanded more than elegance or charm. It demanded endurance, courage, and the ability to walk among storms without faltering. And yet, in moments of quiet, Mary remembered France, the sunlight in the gardens, the music in the halls, the fleeting happiness of being young and admired. Those memories reminded her of both what she had gained and what she had left behind, and of the delicate balance between hope and danger that would mark every day of her reign. For Mary Stuart, returning to her kingdom was not merely a homecoming. It was the first step into a lifetime of trials, where loyalty was rare, betrayal was constant, and the storms she faced were both of the heart and the crown she bore. Love, ambition, and betrayal. Mary Stuart's life in Scotland was no longer measured in the soft luxuries of France, but in the jagged rhythms of politics, passion, and peril. Her marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, promised stability, companionship, and the hope of an heir who could secure her line, yet the union quickly became a landscape of tension and disappointment. What began with affection soon curdled into suspicion, rivalry, and resentment, as Darnley's ambitions clashed with Mary's authority and the needs of the kingdom she sought to govern. The birth of her son, James, brought joy and relief, a momentary triumph that lit the palace with celebration, candlelight reflecting off tapestries and the proud faces of loyal supporters. Yet even this triumph could not shield her from the shadows that crept within her household, where whispers of betrayal and discontent gathered like storm clouds over Holyrood Palace. Every smile from a noble, every word from a servant, became a question, a test, a potential dagger aimed at her reign. Darnley's temperament and demands deepened the fractures around her. The king consort, once cherished, became an adversary, and alliances Mary had counted on began to falter under pressure and intrigue. Rumors circulated with lethal speed, accusations of plots, affairs, and mismanagement, each rumor a spark threatening to ignite the volatile world around her. It was a court where love and power were inseparable, and where desire could twist into betrayal with a single misstep. Then came the assassination of Darnley, a violent and shocking event that shook Scotland to its core. The circumstances were tangled with conspiracy, manipulation, and ambition, leaving Mary surrounded by suspicion and scandal. Her enemies, many who had once pledged loyalty, seized the opportunity to undermine her, framing her both as victim and possible conspirator, questioning her judgment, her alliances, and even her innocence. Mary's resolve was tested daily. She moved through halls that echoed with rumor, across gardens that had once symbolized promise, now haunted by uncertainty, and through councils that measured loyalty in degrees and threats in subtle glances. Every choice was weighed against the possibility of further betrayal, and every step she took was shadowed by the tension between ambition and survival. Even as she grieved, Mary understood the harsh lessons of her reign, that love could be entangled with danger, that ambition often disguised itself as friendship, and that a monarch's power was never secure when the hearts of those closest could so easily turn to treachery. Her life had become a delicate balance, a dance between hope, authority, and the ever-present threat of ruin. In this period of passion, loss, and intrigue, Mary Stuart discovered the cruel truth of her existence, that even a monarch adored and feared could be ensnared by the very people she trusted, and that the crown she wore was both a promise and a trap from which escape was never certain. Chains forged in treachery. Mary Stuart's world tightened around her like iron in the years following Darnley's death, and by 1573, her reign in Scotland was unraveling under the weight of rebellion, suspicion, and conspiracies she could neither control nor fully foresee. Nobles who had once sworn loyalty now plotted openly, using her decisions, her marriages, and even her grief as justification to seize power, fragment her authority, and secure their own dominion. Forced to confront the impossible, Mary faced a council that had once offered guidance but now demanded abdication in favor of her infant son, James VI. Every argument, every plea, every attempt to assert authority was met with resistance from those she had trusted. The same hands that once promised fealty now tightening like chains around her will and freedom. The crown she had worn with dignity and hope became a symbol of entrapment, a heavy reminder that in the world of monarchs, loyalty was conditional and betrayal could be executed with the guise of duty. Imprisoned within the walls of Loch Leven Castle, Mary felt the sting of isolation and the finality of power stripped away. The castle, austere and cold, offered no comfort, only reminders of her diminished status. Barred windows, guards watching her every movement, and corridors echoing with whispers of judgment and condemnation. She moved through the chambers once meant for royalty, now transformed into the confines of captivity, each step a reminder of the conspiracies that had undone her. Even here, Mary's mind remained vigilant, observing, calculating, and remembering the lessons learned in France and Scotland alike. The betrayal of her allies, the manipulations of her enemies, and the precariousness of trust shaped each moment, reinforcing the harsh truth that a monarch's chains are often forged not by enemies alone, but by those closest, those whose promises once seemed unbreakable. Her forced abdication in July 1573 was a public humiliation as well as a personal heartbreak. She signed over the crown to James VI, a child, knowing that her bloodline would continue. Yet she herself would be powerless, a witness to her own displacement. Nobles celebrated their triumphs, each act of subterfuge a dagger sharpened in the name of political necessity, and Mary, once sovereign of a turbulent nation, became a prisoner of the very throne she had once held with authority and hope. Through it all, Mary endured with resilience, her dignity intact though her freedom was gone. She understood that her life was now defined by endurance rather than action, by observation rather than command, and that even in chains her presence, her very existence, remained a threat to those who had betrayed her. In the cold halls of Loch Leven, Mary Stuart learned a truth that would haunt her for the rest of her life, that crowns are not only forged in gold, but in the ambitions, jealousies, and betrayals of those who serve beside them, and that even the strongest monarch may be undone by the very hands sworn to protect her. Exile under Elizabeth's watch. After her escape from Loch Leven Castle, Mary Stuart's hope of reclaiming her throne was brief, for England awaited her arrival with equal parts intrigue and caution. Crossing the border, she stepped into a realm ruled by her cousin, Elizabeth I, a monarch whose calculated composure concealed a wary intelligence, and whose court was a labyrinth of spies, plots, and careful observation. Mary became both guest and prisoner, a sovereign in exile whose presence unsettled the fragile balance of power between England and Scotland. 17 years stretched ahead, a span of time measured in uncertainty, negotiation, and silent despair. Castles and manor houses became her temporary homes, yet each was chosen with care by Elizabeth's advisors, ensuring that Mary's movements were restricted and her influence monitored. Every invitation, every council meeting, every audience carried a silent reminder. She was a threat, even in captivity, for her claim to the Scottish throne and her Catholic faith inspired both loyalty and danger among England's factions. Plots swirled around her like currents beneath a still river. Conspiracies sought to place her back on the Scottish throne, to supplant Elizabeth, or to restore Catholic influence across Britain, yet each plan risked discovery, imprisonment, or death. Mary, ever vigilant, balanced hope with caution, offering counsel, subtle encouragement, and careful participation, yet never overstepping the delicate boundaries imposed by her cousin. Isolation weighed heavily on her spirit. Friends and allies came and went, some true, many false, and betrayals were never far away. Letters that reached her hands were scrutinized, correspondence monitored, and trust became a scarce commodity she could no longer afford freely. Even love was tangled in politics, as every connection was measured for loyalty, every expression of sympathy questioned for hidden intent. Despite the restrictions, Mary remained a figure of fascination and influence. Her intelligence, grace, and regal presence drew those who sought counsel, protection, or favor, yet her captivity kept her ambitions suspended. A queen without a kingdom, her authority acknowledged only in whispers and careful deference. Each day became a lesson in patience, endurance, and survival, for she understood that a single misstep could end not only her plans but her life. Mary's mind never ceased its careful calculation. She observed, remembered, and prepared, knowing that one day, the crown she had lost could still be a source of hope, even if only in the minds of those loyal to her cause. Yet the bitter reality remained. The throne she sought to regain was a perilous prize, and Elizabeth's cautious watch ensured that betrayal, rather than victory, was the more likely outcome. In exile under Elizabeth's vigilant gaze, Mary Stuart learned the cruel patience required of a displaced monarch, the weight of trust and betrayal, and the relentless tension of being powerful in name yet powerless in action, a life suspended between ambition and captivity. Fotheringay's final hour. February 1587 arrived with a cold grey dawn, as Mary Stuart was led through the stone corridors of Fotheringhay Castle, each step echoing like a tolling bell in the quiet halls. The air was sharp with winter, the breath of guards and attendants mingling with the chill that seemed to settle deep into the bones of the old fortress. She walked steadily, regal even in chains, the weight of years, betrayal, and lost kingdoms pressing upon her, yet her composure remained unbroken. For her final hour, Mary had chosen a gown of rich crimson velvet, lined with white satin, the color a subtle homage to her royal blood and a statement of dignity in the face of death. Her hair was arranged simply beneath a coif, her neck bare, and her hands folded calmly before her, a portrait of sovereignty even as she approached the scaffold. Every detail of her attire reflected thought and care, a last assertion of her identity and status before the world took it from her. The trial that had condemned her lingered like a storm that had refused to pass, a tapestry of accusations, conspiracies, and political calculations that had ensnared her from the moment she sought refuge in England. For 17 years, she had been a prisoner of her cousin's vigilance, of plots that threatened her life, and of promises that had proven hollow. Every betrayal she had endured, by Darnley, by Scottish nobles, by false friends, by the very crown she was born to hold, had led her to this final, inexorable hour. The chapel where she knelt to pray was austere, bare stone walls illuminated by flickering candles, shadows stretching long across the floor. In that quiet, Mary reflected on her life, a childhood shaped by ambition, a youth spent learning the cunning of courts in France, a reign in Scotland marked by both triumph and treachery, and years in England measured in confinement and uncertainty. Each memory bore the weight of decisions made and trust misplaced, of love and loss entwined inextricably with the crown she had borne and lost. When the executioner entered, silence fell like a heavy curtain over Fotheringhay. Mary's steps onto the scaffold were deliberate, measured, a final assertion of dignity in a world that had denied her safety and sovereignty. She laid her head upon the block, the chill of the wood beneath her hands a stark contrast to the warmth of her past triumphs and fleeting happiness, and the air seemed to hold its breath in recognition of the life that was ending, the legacy that would endure, and the crown that had demanded so much blood. The blade fell, swift and final, a physical punctuation to the betrayals, conspiracies, and political storms that had surrounded her entire life. Mary Stuart, sovereign of 2 kingdoms, mother, widow, exile, prisoner, was gone from the world she had navigated with courage, intelligence, and grace. Yet in the echoes of that cold February morning, her story lingered, a tale of ambition and trust, of alliances and betrayals, of a crown that demanded both loyalty and sacrifice, and of a life extinguished not by weakness, but by the very forces that power itself had unleashed. Fotheringhay's final hour marked the culmination of a life spent in the interplay of love, ambition, and treachery, a solemn reminder that monarchy, though gilded in glory, is often forged in the fires of betrayal and loss, and that even the most brilliant sovereign can be consumed by the very world she sought to command.